New bearings must be installed correctly in order to work properly. In this part, we'll look at two common methods of installing rolling contact bearings. One method uses a hydraulic press, and the other method uses a tubular drift. We'll start with the tubular drift method. A tubular drift resembles an ordinary length of pipe. The drift should be made of a soft metal to prevent damage to the bearing or the shaft. The inside diameter of the drift must be slightly greater than the inside diameter of the inner ring of the bearing that is being installed. If the drift and the inner ring were exactly the same size, the drift would jam on the shaft. The outside diameter of the drift must never be so large that it touches the rolling elements or the outer ring, because a drift that large could damage the bearing. When a tubular drift is used, the shaft stays stationary and the bearing is forced down the shaft. This method is generally used when the shaft can be removed from the machine and placed in a vise. If the shaft is left in the machine, its other bearings may become Brinelled. The tubular drift method is both simple and efficient. Let's watch a mechanic install a bearing using a tubular drift. First, the mechanic secures the shaft in a vise. He then lubricates the part of the shaft that the bearing will slide over. This will make it easier for the bearing to slide onto the shaft. Next, the mechanic pushes the bearing onto the shaft by hand as far as it will go. He then places the drift over the shaft, checking to make sure that it does not touch the rolling elements or the outer ring. Then the mechanic uses a mallet to pound the drift against the bearing until it is in the correct position. When the inner ring of the bearing is flush against the shaft, the mechanic installs a lock washer and a lock nut. Another common method of installing a rolling contact bearing uses a hydraulic press. A hydraulic press is frequently used to apply pressure to the parts of a piece of equipment that is being assembled or disassembled. With a hydraulic press, the bearing stays stationary and the shaft is pushed through it. When a hydraulic press is used to install a bearing, the first step is to set up the press. First, the mechanic adjusts the height of the bed to fit the length of the shaft. He then places the table plates on the bed. Next, he positions the bearing on the table plates so that only the inner ring is supported. Next, the mechanic lubricates the shaft. The shaft is lubricated before it is placed in the bearing so that it will slide into the bearing more easily. Then he places the shaft in the bearing. The mechanic checks to make sure that the shaft is lined up directly under the ram. Then he places the shaft protector on the shaft and partially lowers the ram into position. Before operating the press, the mechanic checks the whole assembly again to be certain that everything is lined up properly. The mechanic then operates the press. He watches the shaft carefully to make sure that it moves smoothly into the bearing. If the shaft does not move smoothly into the bearing, the mechanic must stop the press because the bearing might be jammed. If this happens, the mechanic must correct the problem and then recheck the alignment of the bearing, the shaft, and the ram. He can then restart the press. After the bearing is on the shaft in the correct position, the mechanic stops the press and inspects the bearing. He checks to make sure that the entire surface of the inner ring is touching the shaft all the way around. The mechanic then removes the bearing and the shaft from the press. In this topic, we saw how to prepare for installing a new rolling contact bearing, and we looked at some installation methods. To test your understanding of what we've covered, try answering some practice questions.